All of us know that big data is the buzzword, or the buzzwords as of late. The question is, what do we do with all the data? First of all, do we want all the data? And secondly, when we get the data, what do we do with it? And I know this is a problem. This confounds a lot of us during the day. We may get, a patient brings in a stack of papers. This is all my charts for the last 7 years. I don't want all that data, right? You don't either. Well, it shows strongly in diabetes as well. So how many people in here deal with, say, at least 10% of your patients being diabetic every day? Yeah? So, how many of you look ahead of time at your clinic and at the schedule beforehand? I would advise against that. Because if you see one of the patients that is a poorly controlled or non-compliant diabetic patient, what do you think? Oh my goodness, my day is going to be tough. I'm going to have trouble getting through this in the allotted time. And so what I'm trying to get across to you during this brief talk is, how do we take the data that is diabetes and turn it into decisions? Because really decisions nowadays are based on data, right? So this is a quick list of the objectives. I'm going to go through quickly, like I said. Patients are interested in the latest technology in diabetes. So I've had the opportunity to be on Fox News a couple of times, and what I've chosen to talk about on the TV is basically diabetes device and how we're managing diabetes through data. And I'll tell you that I am shocked each time that I give these interviews as to how unaware our patients are in terms of what's available in diabetes. So right here I'm showing, does anybody know what I'm showing? So I'm showing a continuous glucose monitor. How many in here are familiar with continuous glucose monitoring? Love it. In fact, my feeling is, as we're moving forward, continuous glucose monitors are not going to be confined to endocrinology. They should instead be spearheaded by primary care, internal medicine, family practice, maybe with initial teaching through endocrinology, but I do not feel that it's this exclusive domain of endocrinologists. And I would recommend or encourage each of you, if you're in the primary care field, to get involved with continuous glucose monitoring, get involved with insulin pumps. Why not? It differentiates us from others. And the sophisticated patients, the ones that are looking online, they want physicians who are up to date on the newest modalities in terms of diabetes. So tell me what's going on here. So this is a continuous glucose monitor off of Dexcom. And as you may know, this gives 288 readings per day. It's every 5 minutes. So tell me what's going on. Just shout it out. Spike, okay, what do you think that's from? Dinner. And then what happened? Hypoglycemia, what happened to cause that? Too much insulin? Could be. Well, here's the first point. So this was me. And I am not diabetic, nor was I on any medication for diabetes. And what this spike represents is 4 bowls of Cinnamon Toast Crunch. So my goal was to see how high I could make my sugar. And then, what happened here? I went to 174. What happened after that? I bottomed out. Why did I bottom out? Hyperinsulinemia, because I am pre-diabetic. My father is diabetic. My pancreas said, whoa, 4 bowls of Cinnamon Toast Crunch. That's ridiculous. I'm going to make a ton of insulin to bring that sugar down. And what it did was it overcorrected, right? Even though I was on no medication that could cause hypoglycemia, right? So this was what we consider to be a postprandial or reactive hypoglycemia, and this is the first clinical sign of prediabetes. Now, the point here in the context of this talk is that data in the absence of context is fairly useless. Because the first thing you said to me was, you must have had a patient that ate a bunch and then gave themselves too much insulin. And of course that would be the assumption. That would be the assumption if I looked at it. But if you don't have context, it's worthless, right? So let's talk about historical overview. Well, things change over time, all right? And so, yes, my mullet phase, I'm still proud of my mullet phase. I was 15, and I think I wore it well, but that's up to you. But look at the difference in just the way that I've looked from crazy stuff, and then now my head's almost shaven. I've changed. Medicine changes, and it changes significantly. And so when you think about how things have changed, we have been wedded, and I would say over-wedded, to hemoglobin A1C for too long. The first studies in diabetes, the DCCT, the UKPDS, were all benched against A1C, right? So we knew that with 1% of this, you had increase of this, and et cetera. But since then, and those were the early 90s, so we're talking about almost 25 years now, we now know that variability is as important, if not more important, than average. So when I was in high school, if I had a semester course and I got an A in the first quarter and a C in the second quarter, I would just not show up for the final. Because if I got an F on the final, I would get a B average. If I got an A on the final, I would get a B average, right? But if you looked at my B average, you would say, well, you must have done really well in that final. And I said, no, I just didn't even show up. Because it's an average. And an average holds a lot of junk. So if we're looking historically, this is kind of where we started. We started with signs and symptoms of diabetes, because we had no reliable diagnostics. And then we went to urine. And believe it or not, the first urine was what? Tasting it, yeah. That's the problem. We're in a better age now. We don't have to taste our patient's urine. And then we went to a dipstick, which was just a range, right? And then we went to the microanalysis. But of course, urine wasn't good enough, and so we went to blood. And same thing, the first glucometers gave you a range, right? You dipped them and it said it's between this and this. And then we went to finger sticks, and then finally CGM. And continuous glucose monitoring is the future of diagnostics. Whether that's an external CGM or an implanted one, it's still the same concept, right? Quick question. How accurate is a glucometer? What do you guys think? What percentage? I wish. So he says plus or minus 10. The FDA allows up to 20. Now that may be changing, but historically it's up to 20%, which means if you have a real sugar of 300, right, that glucometer could tell you 240 or 360. It's 20%. So the first thing we have to kind of get across to our patients is that it's not the gold standard. When you check a finger stick, that is not the absolute perfect level of arterial blood flow. For one thing, there's a lag time. How much lag time between when you have the sugar in the artery to when it gets to the capillary? Any ideas? It's about 25 minutes. So that's the other thing. So once you check a sugar here, what you're checking occurred 20 minutes ago. So it's not the gold standard that we think. So we have to move forward from that. We cannot stay on finger sticks. Finger sticks, just like the urine, are not going to be what ultimately leads us to exquisite and elegant diabetes control. So what percentage of type 1 diabetics use CGM? About 11%. It's getting a little bit better. In my opinion, it should be 50%. And part of it is awareness. Part of it is coverage, but coverage is getting better and better. But I fully expect this number to grow considerably, which means that it would be advantageous for all of us in this room to understand CGM because it's not going away. It's only getting more and more accurate. In fact, the most accurate CGM right now is the XDCAM system, and that has an error rate of about 9 to 11%. So you remember some of the meters are at 20. This one's at 9 to 11%, and it's giving you a reading every 5 minutes. What about data? Well, we know the only way you can diagnose diabetes is either through symptoms and an adjoining venous blood glucose, I guess you could do arterial, but no one's going to do that. So venous blood, glucose or A1C, right? And what's the A1C cutoff? 6.5. And what's the fasting? 126. Let me ask you, doesn't 126 sound weird? Right? What did it used to be? You guys remember, before it was 140, and then it lowered to 126. Any idea why it's 126? Say it loud. No, all right, so 126 and above. So why is it? What's the reason behind it? No? Because we use a set of units that is different than everywhere else in the world. 126 is just the equivalent of 7 in the international units. When you take 7 even and you multiply it times the factor that converts, 7 times 18 is 126. So everywhere else in the world, diabetes is 7, and in the U.S. it's 126. But you can see how there's nothing magical about that number. That is an arbitrary number. It's an even number in the rest of the world so that people can remember it. It's an odd number for us because we're not on the same system. There's nothing magical about it, right? And so when you're looking at data, you remember these are arbitrary cutoffs. We somehow said, okay, at 7, we're going to call it diabetes, 126. We're going to call it diabetes. But 124, we're going to call it prediabetes. There's zero difference in risk. Absolutely zero difference in risk between someone that is in the low 100s and someone that's 126. And so just remember that data can sometimes help us, and then sometimes we put too much emphasis on one number. And patients will come in and say, well, I'm just 123. I'm good. You're not good, first of all. Secondly, if we were to check the corresponding labs, so some of the corresponding labs, the one that I use a lot, I use a test called the glycomark, and I use the test called insulin level. Because those two tests give me much more information than just an A1C. So insulin I'll speak to here, and then I have some slides on the glycomark. But insulin, remember the body, if it has an intact pancreas, is making insulin at a certain rate to keep the sugar down. So early on, the insulin level in prediabetes and diabetes is going to be what? High. A normal fasting insulin is around 5. So if I check an insulin level on a patient that's fasting and the insulin level's 25, then what I know is that that patient's pancreas is making 5 times the amount of insulin just to keep that sugar down, which means that that patient is overworking the pancreas, which means it will burn out eventually, which also means that since insulin is the most obesogenic hormone that we have, and it's anabolic in its every nature, it's going to cause weight gain, central adiposity. The number one cause of obesity in the United States is high insulin, not thyroid, regardless of what your patients tell you. Insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia is also the reason for the quote-unquote metabolic syndrome, because metabolic syndrome is really insulin-resistant syndrome. We called it Syndrome X initially. Then we went to metabolic syndrome because we knew it had something to do with metabolism. And then now we're going to, hopefully, call it insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia syndrome, because every facet of that, including polycystic ovarian syndrome, is linked to high insulin. So I check a lot of insulin levels because that tells me the other side. Because remember, glucose is just the product. It's the work product. The glucose is either compensated or decompensated. Decompensated is diabetes, compensated is prediabetes, right? And then the glycomark. How many in here have heard or used glycomark? 1? So this is very typical. So when I give talks, all over, and I'll have, say, 100 physicians or nurse practitioners, PAs in the room, and less than 5% know what the glycomark is. And the test or the assay has been out for 30 years. Now, it hasn't been FDA approved in the United States for 30 years, but it's been, I think it was 2003 when it was first approved. Well, why do we care? Because variability is a problem. And if we're having huge secondary excursions, if we're having excursions after we eat, that's damaging tissue. And think about it this way. If you have a high sugar, even if it's brief, so you remember my Cinnamon Toast Crunch, right? So it was brief. My pancreas said, whoa, that's not good, and boom. Even brief hyperglycemia hurts tissue, right? But brief hyperglycemia is not going to be enough to weight the A1C. If you check my A1C, it's 5.4, right? But I can drive my sugar up to 170s. 170 is an A1C of 7.5, right? So it depends on how high it goes, and it depends on how long it stays there to whether you get a weighted average, which is the problem. So when we're looking at variability, it's all over the place. Well, how does the glycomark test help? So basically, it's pretty cool, actually. It's a molecule is very similar to glucose. And what it does is basically it's an inverse of the highest sugar. So let's say that my sugar goes to 180 on a routine basis. My glycomark is going to be low. It's an inverse. And the reason is, I think I have a, yeah. So the reason is here. We take in this compound, this 1,5-anhydroglucitol, and that basically goes into the bloodstream, goes into the kidneys, and it gets reabsorbed just like sugar should. What percentage of glucose should be reabsorbed by the kidney? 100%, right? In fact, we have medications now that we're forcing the body to not do that, right? We're forcing that renal threshold down so that we don't have complete reabsorption of sugar. So all of it is supposed to be reabsorbed. So if you think about it, glucose is competing with this 1,5-AG for the same transporters. So what happens when you have hyperglycemia? What happens is they compete. The 1,5-AG doesn't get back in. It gets excreted, right? The glucose gets back in, and so the glycomark goes down. So that's why there's the inverse relationship. And the cool thing about it is this test is representative of 2 weeks. It doesn't have the problems that a fructosamine would have. So we know fructosamine is kind of like a mini A1C. It's 2 to 3 weeks of average. Remember the problems with average. If you have lows, you're going to offset the highs, and you're not going to really know what your excursion rate is, what your standard deviation is. So for those of you that are visual, there's a lot of room. Everybody can get on, but as soon as you have glucose high, you don't have any room for the 1,5-AG. So sometimes I feel like when I give talks to other endocrinologists, they look at me like I'm speaking blasphemy up here, and when I say that we're overweighted to A1C. But if you think about it, when in medicine have we ever stuck to one test for 25, 30 years and not expanded or improved upon it? That's just kind of ridiculous, right? Especially if that test is a 3-month average. And so one of my soapboxes, and in addition to prediabetes and insulin levels and all that stuff, is we've got to get away from being completely wedded to A1C. And in fact, you know it, there's physicians, none of you in here, I'm sure, but that come into the room and they've got what I call the A1C blinders on. They sit down and they say, oh, your A1C was 6.3, you're doing really well, Ms. Smith, I'm going to write your prescriptions and I'll see you in about 6 months. And they walk back out. Didn't ask Ms. Smith if she's had tons and tons of hypoglycemia. Didn't ask Ms. Smith if she's having blurry vision when her sugar goes to 200 briefly. Just focused on the A1C, because I know a lot of reimbursement and that kind of thing is heading that way, but we really shouldn't just focus on one number. It's like patients coming in and just focusing on their LDL. That's all they care about, or now their T level, testosterone level. We have to get above just one number. And you can see, obviously, you can have the same A1C and you can have different levels of excursion. So the standard deviation is as important, if not more important, than the average. Okay? So I tell patients, I would much rather you have an A1C of 7 and be going in between, say, 100 and 200 than an A1C of 6.4 and going between 50 and 220. You can have a better A1C if you sprinkle in a lot of hypoglycemia, right? That's easy. It's just math, just statistics. And this is just a representation that if you have someone that has an A1C of 7.4 Mary, an A1C of 7.4 William, you can see the excursions are much different. The glycomark level is considerably different, 3 versus 15. So I don't want to spend too much more time on this topic because, like I said, we have less time than we were supposed to be given. But I do want to say that when you're trying to figure out what's going on with a patient in terms of sugar, I know you don't want tons and tons of data, but I think one number is not enough. I really think we need to move past this over-reliance on just one number, because that number can be highly misleading. Okay. Let's see. Okay. What about continuous glucose monitoring? So I would say that a glycomark is like a poor man's CGM. It's not going to tell you when the sugars go up, but it definitely tells you the sugars are going up. But the evolution of continuous glucose monitoring has been extremely rapid. And what I mean by that is, say a decade ago when Dexcom came out with their first sensor, you could almost flip a coin and get about the same results, you know? Well, that doesn't help you, right? Because it was pretty bad. But the most recent rendition is extremely accurate, in fact, more accurate than most of the glucometers. So much so that it's become kind of silly because the FDA still requires us to calibrate with a glucometer to make sure that the, say, Dexcom is accurate, which doesn't make sense. If you're calibrating with something that has more error, of course, that's kind of ridiculous, right? This is how it works. You get a wound track that basically gives you a little bit of serosanguinous fluid, so it's not just subcutaneous. It's also got some serous and some blood in there as well. And basically, the sensor is good for about 7 to 10 days. By 7 to 10 days, for one, it's getting dirty and it's kind of gross, and you want to take it out anyway. Some people are just pristine with their sensors, and they'll wear them for 14 days, because they want to save or whatever. But you really got to take efforts not to get it dirty. But basically, what happens is this translates into electrochemical pulses, which get translated into a number that we recognize. Okay, and it goes right underneath the skin. It's a filament that is the size. It's not as small as a human hair, but it's almost. And it's hypoallergenic, so it doesn't cause reaction in most people. And this is what you get back. You get back a pattern, or a lack thereof. Right? This is what I consider, you're either going to get spaghetti back, or you're going to get something that you can treat, right? The key here is, let's not get too enamored with just devices. Let's make sure that we have our patterns and our data first before we start getting crazy with pumps and all kinds of other. I'm totally for insulin pumps. We have thousands of patients on them, but we really need to know what's going on first, right? You're not going to go do a bypass on someone before you do a cath most of the time. You got to find out what's going on, what's blocked, and then you go do the treatment. Historically, because pumps came out before sensors, everybody throws patients on pumps and then says, well, I don't know what the sugar is. That's backwards. I mean, it's obvious. But what we do know is if you put somebody on a CGM, on a continuous glucose monitor, you will get improved A1C, but better than that, you get improved variability. And that's, kind of the message I've been saying over and over again. So what do we look at in terms of error? I would challenge you, if you have someone coming in to your office selling a certain device, which we all do, I would challenge you to ask that person, what's the error rate of your device? And if they can't tell you what the error rate is, then there's a problem, because that's all they're selling is that device. And what it's judged on is its error rate. Believe me, they know what the error rate is, but it's not advertised or promoted because the error rates are often higher than you would consider acceptable, right? And when we determine an error rate, is based on something called an MARD. So there's a YSI, which is the actual gold standard. It's a huge machine here that can process the glucose and tell you exactly what it is, but of course you can't walk around with this machine. So all other devices are geared or compared to the YSI. And then you determine what's called a MARD, or M-A-R-D, a mean absolute relative difference. And it's a bunch of calculus, but the bottom line is how much is it different from the gold standard? Okay? And what I'll tell you is, and this is the principle in one slide. If I calibrate a CGM against a glucometer, so look at the top here. So the sensor is the blue, the meter is the black, and the YSI is the red. If I go against a glucometer, I'm all over the place. If I calibrate against the YSI, my sensor is almost perfect. So where is the error here? The error is in the glucometer. The error is in the patient not doing what they're supposed to with the blood, not getting enough blood on there, eating grapes before they do it. All these things that they do, licking their finger right before. And it creates an error. Well, I did a little test on this myself. So if you're ever wondering about something, just do it yourself. This is not scientific, but it doesn't matter. This is my son a few years ago, and we did a 7th grade science fair, and what we did, we had one subject, that was me, the human father, and I was willing to undergo 40 finger sticks. Yes, I did. We controlled with a Dexcom G4, which I wore on my belly, of course, and then we tested a variety of glucometers, all the way from the cheapest to the most expensive at the time, and all of them had a variance that was at least 7 to 9% away from the Dexcom. Is this scientific? No. But what it showed me was, whether it was a $7 meter or a $70 meter, it still wasn't hugely accurate. And this was the same blood, so I would get a good amount of blood and I'd put it on all the strips, Yeah, I know, it was kind of crazy. But it was good for his science project, right? I mean, and it was unique. Bottom line is, don't get enamored by one number, whether that one number is an A1C or that one number is a finger stick. It's just one number. What about error? I put these in here because I think it's important to go through it quickly. And I'm not going to spend too much time because it's pretty boring, but it's important to know that not all errors are equal. And let me give you an example. There are some errors that, no matter the fact that you're off, it's not going to change anything. It's not going to hurt the patient. You're not going to change your treatment. It's what we call a zone A error. All right? And so if you look at, this is the gold standard here, and this is what your finger stick shows. So as long as it's in this area, it's not going to hurt you, because we're not going to change management. And then there are some benign errors where, yeah, it's a little bit off. Let's say that the real sugar is 200, but it tells you it's 100. You're not going to really do anything, so you're going to stay in a benign or non-catastrophic range. But if you start getting way off, then you start overcorrecting. Let's say that the actual number is 150, but the finger stick tells you it's 70. Okay, so what are you going to do? You're going to drink orange juice, or you're going to squirt, cake icing in your mouth or something. Bring that sugar up. Well, the sugar was really already 150, so you're going to create hyperglycemia. And worse is the other side, right? And then there's the failure to detect. So if you have a patient that, let's say, the sugar really is 50, but the finger stick says it's 150, then you're just not going to do anything. Well, what's going to happen is the sugar is going to continue to fall. And then the final error, the ones that are catastrophic and deadly, is where you're completely off to where the real sugar may be 300, it tells you it's 50, or the real sugar is 50 and it tells you it's 300. These are absolutely catastrophic. But you know the old adage, bad data in, bad data out, right? So what I'm getting at, and I think I've said it probably too many times now, we have to make sure that the integrity of the data that we're getting is appropriate. Right? It's not going to be perfect. None of them are perfect. Once you start throwing CGM on top of it, you're not only having errors in the absolute number, but then you have errors in direction. So the CGM is telling you it's going higher when it's actually going lower, and that just compounds the error. So I want to be sensitive to your time. We have more slides. They're on your disc, or I guess the website. I want to leave some time for questions. My summation statement would be that we are in an era of big data, and that's not in and of itself bad. It's just we have to differentiate which part of that data is reliable, relevant, and helps us make decisions. If it doesn't help us make decisions, discard it. Right? Then it's just superfluous. There's no reason to have it. But if it helps you make a decision, then you have to understand, okay, is this data that I'm going to generate a decision on, is it accurate? If it's accurate, then I can feel confident that I'm making the right decision. And so when you're testing by blood, of course we're going to check an A1C. No one's ever going to tell you don't check an A1C, but A1C is not enough. You got to go with some other markers, especially if the clinical picture does not mix with what you're seeing. So insulin levels and glycomark are two adjuncts. In fact, I think we have a rep at the back, Paul Santos from AccuReference, that can discuss any of these labs, including the glycomark. But having those adjunct tests will help to decipher what's actually going on. And then secondly, don't be afraid or reticent to get into diabetes device. And if anyone here, my email's on here somewhere, I think. If you have questions or you want me to help with some of that in terms of transition, I love when we have physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, other than endocrinologists doing diabetes device. Love it. In fact, in my system, I have 13 mid-levels, and I guarantee you that 3 or 4 of them know more about CGM than the other endocrinologists, or many of the other endocrinologists in Orlando, because we just do tons and tons of it. And it's really just, at the end of the day, pattern recognition. That's all it is. There's nothing magical about it. It's not, I don't pretend to be wise because I can interpret. It's just pattern recognition. It's knowing what to do and making sure you have the context against the pattern, right? Because we got fooled with the pattern at the beginning because we didn't have the context around it. So I'm going to stop there because I think, like I said, I'm not going past 6. I want to have a little bit of time for questions if you have questions. And then the other, say, 20 or 30 slides that are there are certainly available to you on the website or on your jump drive. And I'm open to you reaching out to me by email if there's something that's not clear. So what questions or comments or concerns you got? Yeah, you can yell them out until she gets there.
There's a commercial on TV from the CDC that says, talk to your doctor about the test. The problem is, you don't tell anybody what the test is.
Yeah. Oh, I know. So for those of you that didn't hear, there are certain commercials that will say, talk to your doctor about this test or another test, but it doesn't really explain to the patient what they're asking for, right? Same thing with medications. Go talk to your doctor about Lamisil. Well, I don't know. I guess, do I need Lamisil? No, apparently I don't. I don't have fungus, but I should ask my physician anyway. Yeah, that's a problem. I don't know how to get around that. We could talk a while just on direct-to-consumer ads. There's problems with that. Go ahead.
It's presented by the CDC,
yeah,
or representative of the CDC, and they're asking to have your doctor check this test. I'm assuming it was the A1C, but it may be one of the other tests that you mentioned.
If it's from the CDC, it's going to be the A1C. Yeah, because but they should go further and say, there is a test that gives you a 3-month average of your sugar levels. Ask your doctor about that test. They shouldn't just say, go ask for a test. But I would argue, as we're moving forward, that the A1C is not enough. What else? Yes, sir.
Who would you recommend if we do
I'll repeat it.
continuous glucose monitoring for how do we present it to the insurance company? Most of us have type 2 patients.
Yeah.
So is it just the guy who's not controlled?
So I'll repeat it. The question was, who do I recommend that you put on continuous glucose monitoring systems, and how do we get that covered by insurance? The answer is almost all type 1s, and I mean almost like 97% of type 1 patients are covered. Type 2, you'd be surprised. There's more coverage than you think. And I didn't get to the slide, but we've put over 800 type 2 patients on continuous glucose monitors. So we've got it covered. And it's gotten easier and easier to do that. It doesn't mean you might not get back a prior authorization or something. But what I would do is, if you're going to get involved in diabetes device, don't go alone. Get your local device representative. So, like for example, the CGM representative for Dexcom. That is their job to get that covered. And so I just text them, and I hope I'm HIPAA compliant compared to the last talk. But I text them and say, I have a patient for you, and they can call back and find out the information. Yeah.
How close are we to seeing like a working bionic pancreas?
Yeah. So that was the last couple of slides. So where are we on a bionic pancreas? The issue with the biotic or artificial pancreas has always hinged on the sensor. It is not hinged on the pump. We've been able to deliver insulin exquisitely enough for 20 years. So it's never that. It's always been, what is the data in? What is my sugar? What is it doing? And can I be confident that that number that I see on a screen is the real number or close enough? With the MARD that we talked about briefly, getting down to the sub-10 level, we're now at a point where the FDA will allow what we call factory calibrated sensors, meaning that you don't have to do any finger sticks. Now, it's not quite there yet, but it's probably in this next year or maybe early 17 is what I predict, that we'll have something that comes out of the box, you put it on, you don't have to have any finger sticks. Once that happens, then we'll have the artificial pancreas, because that's the side that's always been missing, not the pump. Yeah. What else? Yes, please.
What's your criteria for putting that type 2 diabetic? What would be?
Yeah, I didn't finish that answer for him, sorry. So a type 2 patient that is on multiple daily doses of insulin, who's not well controlled, can be covered for CGM. And I put, like I said, hundreds of patients on, because we don't want to forget about the type 2 patient. The type 2 patients nowadays, especially the longer they're in disease, they operate like type 1s, right? The pancreas is gone, right? So not only is the pancreas not working, they have huge insulin resistance, so they have both. They got both sides. And so when we see type 2 patients having, a lot of hypoglycemia or a lot of excursions, let's say you do that glycomark and it comes back that they're going up to, 220 or 250, right? Well, you know that they're not checking their sugar, and there's only one way you could know how high it goes, is if you check it all the way up and then all the way down. No one's going to do that, right? So I like the glycomark is like those. You know how if you're at the fair and you hit the thing and it goes up, and if you just get it there, it'll hit the bell. That's what it is. The CGM not only tells you the bell was hit, it tells you how fast it went up and how fast it went down. And so I look at other markers to say, do I need to put a type 2 patient on a sensor? But you don't have to go from no diabetes device to just, full, both feet in the water. You can take a couple patients that need it and say, you know what, I don't necessarily need to wait the whatever months it is to see an endocrinologist. I can do this myself. Call the Dexcom rep and say, look, I'm just looking at this. Can you come by and talk to me about the sensor? I would start with sensor before pump, because remember, sensor is going to tell you the pattern, and then the pump is going to deliver the insulin. Well, I hope that was clear. I know that we're the last talk of the day, and I know you're tired, and I know we started late, but I hope that was worth you staying for. And I'll be up here afterwards to answer any questions if you have anything that comes to mind. Appreciate you guys to let me come.